What's going on, guys? I'm Zach, your host of the Aux Podcast. And today I want to talk about the recent Game Changers debate on the Joe Rogan podcast between Chris Kresser and Jamie Wilkes. So, the Game Changers, if you guys haven't seen it, is a documentary that recently came out on Netflix about the benefits of plant-based eating for athletes. And Chris Kresser and Jamie Wilkes are the two guys that were on this podcast. Just as some background information, Chris Kresser is an advocate of functional medicine, globally recognized leader in the field of ancestral health, paleo nutrition, and functional and integrative medicine. James Wilkes is a retired MMA fighter and one of the producers of Game Changers. So a few weeks ago, Joe Rogan had Chris Kresser on to his podcast, and Chris Kresser allegedly debunked the Game Changers documentary. He made all of these notes and refuted these points. And the consensus after that podcast was that the Game Changers was debunked. And then last week, Joe Rogan had James Wilkes on to defend the Game Changers documentary, and he made a lot of good points. And this was with Chris Kresser on the podcast. So it was kind of Chris and James going head to head about this documentary, with Joe Rogan stepping in and moderating as things went on. And this isn't a podcast about me saying I agree with plant-based eating or veganism or eating meat, things like that. I do eat meat, but I also enjoy vegan food. I've been to a lot of great vegan restaurants in NYC, but this is besides the point. The point I want to make is that I loved this style of debate. It was a 4-hour total debate. I'm still about 2/3 through the podcast. So if I do finish it, I have about an hour and a half left. But I loved this long form debate style, this 4-hour back and forth debate style, because it was kind of like it had the feel of a 12-round boxing match where, guys are landing jabs. James is debunking Chris's points. Chris is pointing out where James had went wrong, and these guys are taking shots at each other back and forth, building momentum, losing momentum. It had the feel of a boxing match where guys are getting in the ring and trying to take down the other person. If there's like a long form audio boxing match, and it made me think about all of the short form audio in today's mainstream media, like Fox News, CNN, all these little 30-second sound bites, even the presidential debates, where people are asked a question that requires hundreds of hours of research and hours to respond to, and that person is expected to give this 30-second or minute long answer that completely gives a solution to a whole problem, and then that answer is then pushed through the media and people tear it down and say, this is wrong, this is bullshit, or yeah, this is the answer to everything. And so that's why I really enjoyed this debate on Joe Rogan, because it kind of tore through that soundbite sentiment. And so, yeah, to get into it, the momentum is something that I noticed. The first maybe 20-30 minutes of this podcast, Chris seemed like he was gonna win this thing. Like, if I stopped listening after 30 minutes, I would have said, okay, the Game Changers documentary is bullshit. Chris has a lot of good points, and that's it. Because James Wilkes seemed like he was more emotional. And I get it, because he's a producer of the film. He wants to defend what he made, and he invested thousands of hours of his life into researching and creating and working on this film. And he's also a former MMA fighter, so he knows a lot about nutrition and athletic performance and just overall performance. And so I get that James was more emotional at the beginning, but then the momentum started to turn, because there were things like vitamin B12 supplementation. There were things about protein with vegan protein versus animal protein. And James is really holding his own and actually made Chris look bad at a lot of points and upholding a plant-based eating for athletes. And I think the consensus after this podcast, and it seems to be the consensus on social media, YouTube comments, things like that, when I took a look, is that James ultimately won the debate if you're going to assign a winner. And Joe Rogan actually said after the debate, and keep in mind, Joe Rogan is a guy that hunts elk and loves eating meat. He's been a proponent of meat eating on the podcast. He eats vegetables too, of course, but he's not a guy who is pro vegan. And after the podcast, he actually said that he would consider taking down the original debunking, in quotes, debunking of the Game Changers film with just Chris Kresser after this debate. So James Wilkes must have made an incredible impact on Joe Rogan with the information he was presenting. And Chris kind of felt like he was defeated on the podcast. Honestly, Chris started out strong, and then as the podcast went on, he spoke more and more softly, got very reserved, and at many points just wasn't even talking for 20, 30 minutes straight. It was just James and Joe on the podcast. And these are all things that you don't get in the mainstream media nowadays. I loved this back and forth momentum. You can build momentum on a podcast. You can get things right in your favor. You can feel good. You can go through a stretch of 20, 30 minutes where, you're making your point in a debate on a podcast. And then, maybe you get hit with a brick wall and you lose your momentum, but then you build it back up. You get a chance to verbalize the intricacies of your position without being cut off and without having to fit into a 30, 60-second time frame. And something like it's like in the presidential debates where people these candidates get asked, what are you going to do to solve healthcare, or what are you going to do to solve our foreign policy problems? What are you going to do to fix the border between US and Mexico? And then they say, go, you have 30 seconds. Like, how the fuck are you supposed to answer that? You need hours and hours to go over all of the intricacies of each of those positions. And the same thing with plant-based eating and meat eating. There's so much research and so many different ways to tackle it, so many different ways to look at it. So regardless of the outcome of this debate, I'm appreciative of Joe Rogan for having these two guys on to kind of duke it out. And if I had only heard sound bites of this conversation, I wouldn't have been able to come to the conclusion that I have. And I think I'm going to look more into plant-based eating because of this podcast. Like I said, I love eating meat, but if I was just listening to these guys go back and forth for 30 seconds at a time, or maybe, I just saw a 60-second clip, the media, CNN or something, pulls 60 seconds of what James says and 60 seconds of what Chris says. That's the only thing I see from the debate. It's impossible as a listener to come to a well-informed, meaningful conclusion just based off of that shit. And this podcast has gotten streamed millions of times, and people love listening to podcasts. People have proven that they love listening to long form podcasts. There are people that will sit down and listen to 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours of a podcast. And I think that we're kind of hit over the head with the fact that we don't have long attention spans and we need this short form content. But I think that podcasting, if anything, has proven that people will listen to shit for 2 hours if it's something they're interested in. And it's a platform like Joe Rogan where people are allowed to speak their minds and not getting cut off, and they get a fair shot to make their opinion known and say it clearly. And, maybe it's a crazy idea, but maybe we need someone like Joe Rogan that comes in and says, I'm going to offer my platform to moderate the presidential debates. Instead of having 10 people on a stage and have them each talk for 5 minutes and learn nothing, it's more like political theater. They're not even, you can't call what's happening today debates. It's literally political theater. Have someone like Joe Rogan come in with 2 or 3 candidates at a time, talk to them for 2 or 3 hours, and you can't hide. That's the great thing too. You can't hide on a podcast. If you don't know what you're talking about, you will get exposed. And I think that's kind of what happened to Chris on the podcast. James Wilkes exposed a lot of the fallacies of his thinking and the fallacies of how he evaluates research. So if you're a presidential candidate, you don't know what the fuck you're talking about in foreign policy or the border or healthcare. You can have talking points and sound smart for 30 seconds or a minute, but if you get on a podcast for 2 hours and you don't know what the fuck you're talking about, there's nowhere to hide. People will see that you're a piece of shit. You don't know what you're believing. You don't know what you're saying, and you're just spouting off these talking points. Or you do know what you're saying and you can defend it and you can clearly enunciate your position. And even if people don't agree with you, they will still understand where you're coming from. So I just wanted to share my feelings on this latest debate with Joe Rogan, Chris Kresser, and James Wilkes. Joe Rogan was the moderator. And I encourage you guys to check it out, or at least part of it, because I think this could be a future format of debates on podcasts. I really like how this was run. Jamie, who's Joe Rogan's assistant, pulled up slides and was giving screenshots of what each guy was talking about the whole time, so that helped too. And I loved the way that Jamie was pulling all that up. But yeah, go check this out. I think this is an incredible way to have debates between two people on important topics, and I will see you guys next time.